enough to be born to a family that happened to be royalty, and you yourself get to be royalty. It's a very luck based uh, uh, governmental system. And then because you were born lucky, you get to make the decisions. There's also totalitarianisms. We would know those as dictatorships or despotisms, a form of government in which power resides in a leader who rules according to self interest and without regard for individual rights and liberties. These individuals make decisions purely on their own whim. Some of them, and many of them, make decisions just what benefits their interest, and with no regard for the citizenry. If it works for them, if it works to keep them in power, usually that's the decision that is made. And that's what a totalitarianism or a dictatorship or a despotism would fall under. We also have oligarchies, a form of government in which the right to participate is conditioned on possession of wealth, social status, military position, or achievement. Now, it does not have to be all of these things. It could be a characteristic where you build a government based on wealth, and so the rich rule, or a government based on social status where the well off rule, or the high connected rule, or a government based off of military position, which all decisions are made by military leaders, or achievement, where education would be an achievement. People of high esteemed educational background end up being the ones in charge. We also have aristocracies, a government that governs is governed by the few in service of the many, which is an interesting term for aristocracy because aristocracies are very similar to monarchies, but instead of having one ruling family, you have groups of ruling families or groups of ruling bodies. And so if you were born into that higher class, you are of the class that can make decisions and govern, and that would dictate how the everybody else rules. And it says the aristocracy is the few in service of the many, and really it's the few making decisions for the many, and that's what an aristocracy is. Individuals of kind of the nobility, the higher class, who get to make decisions for everybody else. We also have, again, a democracy, a system of government that gives power to the people, whether directly or indirectly. So a democracy does not have to be representative. A democracy can be direct, where everybody gets to weigh in, or a democracy can be indirect, where a chosen group of people who are chosen by the people get to weigh in. It doesn't have to be, it could be one way or the other. So I have a question. Actually, we had a couple questions in the PowerPoints to make you think and to make you kind of raise questions. And so, what type of government do we have? Could we have something other than a democratic republic? Because you want to ask yourself the question, when was the last time a president wasn't either, and then from one of these categories, well off or well educated, or from a military background, or from some sort of achievement? And it actually takes a significant amount of time to go back in time to answer that question. And probably the person who would fall under the characteristic outside of those realms would be Abraham Lincoln. That's almost 160 years ago, 150 years ago. Now, many are going to say, well, Lincoln was well educated, but his educational background was completely self-taught. He was able to, through jobs, buy books, and then his becoming a lawyer was much different than our being lawyers today, where you go to law school. He apprenticed under an individual, and in many aspects taught himself the basics of law before he was able to apprentice. And so that might be the case. Now, again, for testing purposes, we are a democratic republic. We are a group of people who choose our representatives, and those representatives govern on our behalf. But we might be something different if the category of people that we choose is far smaller than where we think it really is. If we are able to choose anyone, but we only choose a group of people who are either, well networked or rich or, super well educated. Now, again, education is important. But if we only are choosing from a small group of people, is it really a government that can be representative of us all if we can't choose from a broader base of people? The United States government today is fairly unique when it was created, and it's like still fairly unique today. There are two categories that were unique in its foundation and have spread to other governments over time. So the idea of personal liberty and the idea of equality were very unique to the government that we will build and will become the government of the United States of America. Personal liberty, it's a key characteristic of our U.S. democracy and means freedom from government interference in many instances. Our Bill of Rights lays out our freedoms from government interference, and that was unique because in the world we usually prior to the United States government, it was government has the power to do these things, and it really didn't lay out any rights of the people. But we're going to start seeing that there are liberties, some guarantees that we've decided that Americans should have that were laid out in the Bill of Rights. Those rights against government interference, freedom from government interference in these 10 areas. And that was very unique to what it would become. The Constitution was crafted for Americans to have freedom from government interference when it came to freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, our right to bear arms, searches and seizures, and a lot of that was, and actually we have many more, but a lot of that was based on the interaction that we had with Great Britain and the monarchy during our colonial times, and we said, well, there are certain rights that are guaranteed and should not be infringed upon as citizens of a government. And so we put them into words and we said these are guarantees and we should not infringe upon them. And today, except for in the most egregious reasons to infringe upon them. Again, if I do something wrong, I can be searched. And so I don't have a complete freedom from search by government. But if there's a reason that government thinks I should have done so, I might have done something, I can be searched. So they're not absolute in all respects, but these are some of the most some of the strongest protections that we have from government infringing on our liberties. We also have equality. Over time, with the addition of the 14th Amendment and the focus on due process and equal protection under the law that we find in the 14th Amendment, our civil rights have come into play. The emphasis on the right to work, the right to go to school without discrimination, developed political equality. The principle that all citizens are the same in the eyes of the law. Now, many of you are going to say, well, Mr. Walton, that doesn't exist. All people aren't the same in the eyes of the law. Well, on paper, it is true. And what you're feeling might be a little bit different than what political equality is. So political equality is, again, all people, no matter where we live. If you live in, Portland, Maine, or Alaska or San Diego, California, or out in Hawaii, or all the way down to the tip of Florida, the vast reaches of the United States, federally, all of your rights are the same as everyone else in the United States. Now, does that mean we have the same access to those rights? Well, no. Our equality is the same. We're all supposed to be treated the same under the law, and that's what makes us equal. Our system does have a way of, and this is not governmental, but life systems have a way of affecting government. And so, because somebody has more money to be able to buy to afford a better attorney, or a attorney that might have more resources, they might have a different protection in a criminal case than you would if you just didn't have that access to that top level attorney because of monetary differences. Or you might not be able to research something that could help you in your defense of your person. So we all are the same in the eyes of the law. Now your access to that law is different. I more than many would probably understand that being there are differences in how people are treated based on racial context in the world, or gender context in the world, and other contexts in the world, and those do exist. But if we were to look at the foundation of what was said and how the law is supposed to apply, we are all equals in the eyes of the law. Now, somebody's going to say, well, what about slavery? Well, let's take the context of the day. I like to liken our Constitution and our framers, the people who built the Constitution, people who are laying the foundation. This is why we call them founders and the framers. We kind of analogize them to people building a home. So they're, to start a home, you lay out a foundation, or to start a home, you lay out the framing of a home. I like to analogize them to Orville and Wilbur Wright, the people who invented the first airplane, or a facsimile thereof, or something similar to an airplane. Our founders, when they're laying out the Constitution and laying out the foundation of our government, are living in a much different world than we are today. Again, I'm never going to excuse slavery, the actions of people who enslave individuals, but the world context was fairly different. Slavery was allowable. The treatment of women was far different than it was today. My grandmother, was a nurse and had her own job, but her credit card said Mrs. Henry Walton on that credit card, which was my grandfather's name. And so women didn't even have their, until even very recently, in the last 30, 40 years, really 40 years, women didn't have the rights that they do even today. Again, in many states until the 1960s, there was no such thing as marital rape or marital abuse. And so you were kind of the property of your husbands until now. So the world and how people live and how people interact is based on the world in which they live. And so our framers live in a world where women's rights aren't the same as they are now, and the rights of minorities aren't the same as they are now, and it reflects in how they live their lives. But they're going to lay out a document that allows for the freedoms to expand to what they are today. Same with the Orville and Wilbur Wright. They're going to lay out the foundation to what will become a 747 and and these giant airplanes that we see fly through the sky. But what they built out of bicycle and motorcycle parts is definitely not a 747. They have a concept in which they're trying to build, and it's going to evolve over time, but it's not where it needs to be at the start, where it ends up at the finish. And so we need to take that into consideration. And again, not going to apologize for any forms of slavery or discrimination against any sort of people, but they're laying out that foundation. And all of it is due to the world in which they grow up in and the world in which they live. And so there are certain things that come into play. And so we have popular consent, the principle that governments must draw their power from the consent of the governed. Again, the people under our governmental system are going to lay out what government can do. I think sometimes we might forget that, but the people are the basis. If we were to put the power of government, the government into a triangle and the people with the most power at the top, the people are at the top. The people choose the people who are in power, and the people in power lay out the structure of what government is to be. And so that's when you have a democratic system. That is the foundation of that. Now, the pyramid looks a lot different in dictatorships and totalitarianisms or monarchies that are true monarchies. But in a government that is formed by the consent of the governed, the people are at the top. So how do we determine that? Well, we use what is called majority rule. Majority rule states that when we vote or when we weigh in, we are going to take what the majority states is the best course of action, and that's what we're going to follow. Now, why would we be okay with that? Well, you've learned this since you were very young, the majority rule understanding. Everybody's been in school and they say, okay, well, who wants to go outside for recess? And a group of people raise their hand. And who wants to go to the gym for recess? And a group of people raise their hand. And the teacher will look at who has more, and that's how we're going to determine where we're going to be. And the reason that's okay is because if we're in that losing group, we know that there's an opportunity that the next time that we do that interaction, we could be in the majority, because this is not a one-shot game. We don't just have it. This doesn't happen one time. It happens a bunch of times, and so it's not just this one time in history that we get to vote on it. And so now it also does not guarantee that any time in the future we're going to be in that winning group, but it's possible. And because we understand that we could be the ones making the decisions in the future, we're okay with how decisions are made, and that's how majority rule works. Now, majority rule exists, but we also have to make sure we understand that we have to have some minority right. So majority rule exists, but we do have minority right, meaning that we're not going to disrespect the group that's in that smaller group. We're not going to just run roughshod over the ability that they have to interact in our system. But that's how majority rule works. In the United States, we have what is called the first past the post rule. One vote that gets us past 50%. They say 50% plus one vote, which means it's 50 point, however small the decimal behind the zero, behind the 50 is 50.00000, however many zeros, and then when we get to that next one, that's the majority. It doesn't have to be 51%. It just has to be 50 and whatever small amount that you get. So let's take it as football. If you were running down the field and you get to the 50 and then you fall and you, however small that football gets beyond the 50%, however minute it could be, it doesn't have to be the whole ball, it didn't even have to be a tenth of the ball, it didn't even have to be 1% of the ball. As long as a part of that ball crosses that 50-yard line, you're beyond that, you have the majority. And that's how that would work. Popular sovereignty, the notion that the ultimate authority of society rests with the people. Again, I'm kind of going to reiterate that what our system today is based off of what the people decide it to be. And then there's a typo in here, so I want to make sure you understand that it's a natural law, not national law. Natural law. So under notes, make an adjustment there. Natural law, doctrine that society should be governed by the certain ethical principles that are part of the natural, by part of nature, and as such can be understood by reason. Again, that is the foundation leading into social contract theory. Again, we all have there are rights that are instilled in us by nature, but we give up some of those natural rights in order for government to provide safety and security. Another characteristic that's fairly unique to America is our individualism. The American democracy is unique because it puts importance on individualism. There are other democracies in the world that put society in front of the individual. Well, our liberty-based understanding says, well, if something infringes on my individual right, we probably shouldn't do it. Well, there are a backs and forths with that. Canada has universal health care. So they said, the health of the entire society is more important than the extra taxes that we take from the individual. So you are individually infringed upon in Canada to pay more money in order for them to have universal health care. That's a benefit that they said societally should happen. Well, we in the United States have, for the longest time, and we might be in a little bit of flux with this, have said, if it infringes upon the rights of one individual, we should not do that action. And that has worked for the United States for a long time. However, now we've gotten into a point where one individual's right might be bumping into the heads of another individual's right, which is causing a lot of the argument and the discussion that we're having today, because individual rights of people can collide with one another in the same when it comes to protection. And so that's where the debate comes into. Do we take money from individuals through taxing to help other individuals? And depending on your ideology, your personal belief system, some people are going to say yes and some people are going to say no, but they're both right on their own personal belief system. Now, if we were to say, ask government, can government reorient money to give to others under the Constitution? Yes, we can. The Constitution allows for that to happen. So can government reorient money through taxes? And we've established through amending the Constitution that government can do that. So now how or should we be doing it, that's a different story. But through the 16th Amendment and the creation of the federal income tax, government can. But again, under our Bill of Rights, there are certain unalienable rights that government should not infringe upon, except for in the most extreme circumstances. So there are certain characteristics of America and certain characteristics of our government that exist. Religious freedom and faith. Our framers acknowledge that the settlers came to the New World seeking religious freedom. However, there's no guarantee to religious freedom in the United States. Again, so you have religious freedom if you come here and you can believe whatever you want to believe. Now, putting into practice, that's a totally different story, and we'll get that into that with chapter 4 when we get into civil liberties and your belief system. Not everything religiously that you believe you can do, because it might violate somebody else's right or violate the law. But we have religious tolerance that says you can believe whatever you want to believe. And so colonies had the clash over religion. We have a current, kind of since 9/11, kind of a current butting of heads with the Islamic faith on the extreme end of the Islamic faith. And so there's a butting of heads there because of the actions of 9/11. Many people viewing the Islamic faith as the cause of that, or those differings of people there. So we see that in the United States, we've had many different altercations in the last several years of shootings in churches or in mosques or in other places. A lot of that having to do with the individuals not being tolerant of other individuals. So we were founded on the tolerance, but we do see we were founded on the idea of religious freedom, but we do see that there's some issues when addressing the tolerance with one another in the United States even today. Establishing justice. Our preamble, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice to secure domestic tranquility, to provide for a common defense, and those ideas of the preamble. So again, establish justice and secure domestic tranquility, to provide for a common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty. Those are parts of our preamble. Those are very interesting in how we created our government. We created our government with those early foundations before we got into the Constitution. And our Constitution reiterates or restates those understandings. Again, the creation of a system of laws that allows individuals to abide by a common set of principles, the consent of the governed, and social contract theory. The rule of law allows for rational dispensing of justice. We know what the penalty for an action is going to be before it is done. We know what the rules are, and again, under the equality standard, they should all be carried out equally. Again, your access to our government might change or create variations in that, but again, the rule of law is supposed to be equal across the people. Congress create the federal judicial system authorized by the Constitution, and we also have the Bill of Rights, which again lays out the protections that we are guaranteed in the subsequent and the following amendments that give us additional protections. Ensuring domestic tranquility. In times of struggle, government power has expanded under the understanding that it's going to protect us. There was one point in time where we didn't have to stand and get an x-ray before getting on planes. But you got to remember this, we don't have the right to fly. The flying is a convenience, it's something that it's a privilege. And so you don't have the right to privileges. You have the right to well, I don't want to say you have the right to rights, but your liberties are guaranteed, your privileges are not. And so flying is a privilege, and I don't know if you guys realize this, but you're getting into a flying tube, a tube that is flying through the air at hundreds of miles an hour at thousands of feet above the ground. And so people want to be safe while they're in that flying tube. Well, hopefully I didn't mess anybody up and not want them to discourage them for flying, but that's what it really is. And so we've said, okay, with this privilege, there are certain responsibilities that you have to do before you are able to take advantage of this privilege. And since 9/11, we now scan each other. We go through the bags. We look at differing electronic devices to make sure that they are what they are supposed to be in order for people to fly through the air safely. And if you've never seen what a scan of the body looks like, this is what it looks like. This actually used to be on the TSA's website, where you can see the scan of a person. And this is very invasive. You're able to see parts of the body that would normally be considered private. If the scan of a person is almost like seeing them naked, which is something that we reserve for only the most intimate people in our lives. And so this is a invasion of your Fourth Amendment protection, but you consent to do so. You don't have to fly, and so you have a choice. If I'm going to fly, I need to understand that my person might be searched in a way that I might not feel comfortable with, but that's the choice that you have to have. If you don't want to be scanned so you can take the 3-hour plane ride to New York, you need to take the 14-hour drive to New York. And so that's what we've established, because this is a privilege and not a right. And so again, it does infringe on your rights, but again, you have a choice in that matter. You don't have to fly. Providing for a common defense. The defense of America's citizens. The President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, National Guard, U.S. Army and Navy. All of our military all falls under the protection of the President, and it's their job to protect us in issues foreign and domestic. Promoting for the general welfare. We have the many functions of offices that were created under this doctrine. There are many arguments that this is not what this means, but under this category, we've kind of laid out the creation of the Social Security Administration, Medicare, Medicaid, and other regulatory agencies that govern the safety and health of the people. We want a healthy society, so we mandate that children be vaccinated before going to schools. We mandate that We allow for the redistribution of money again for to individuals who may not be able to afford or provide for themselves. And again, this is again to provide to create some sort of at least minimum living standard for people to be safe and healthy. And so that's where those arguments come from. Not saying that they're right or wrong in any sense, because many people are going to say we shouldn't provide for others in these ways. But this is where the foundation of that comes from. Secure the blessings of liberty. We are free to criticize and petition our government when we disagree with it. Under the First Amendment, we have the right to petition and to challenge what government is doing, and it's our right to do so. We saw the challenging of government bailing out the banks in Wall Street several years ago in order to stabilize the economy during the Great Recession. But many people were very upset because they were taking tax monies to do so, and you as an individual would not have that option if things were going wrong in your behalf. So let's talk about early America and America today. Early America was mainly fairly different than America today. Mainly one language, 4 million people over 13 states. That's negotiable. I don't think we're counting slaves, nor are we counting Native Americans in that number. So there are more people who are living here during that time. Protestant church heritage, voters were white male landowners, and there's a significant difference between that point in time and this point in time. We have a huge change in the population of the United States. There have been two large immigration periods in the United States in the early 1900s and then again in the 1980s. In 1967, and the population of the United States, 76% of the population of the United States was Caucasian Americans, white Americans. In 2008, it was almost a little bit over 50%. And so we see with the growth of the minority populations that we were getting to where it's a more diverse population of the United States. And even in today, it's about, I think, 54%. 54% Caucasian is the largest population growth. Now, again, if that population growth dips below 50%, it's still the majority population unless another population group, another racial group, or another classification gets becomes the largest. So we want to make sure that we don't say, well, that group is not the minority, is a minority group as well. No, you're the majority as long as you have the largest racial group. So there's a lot of different terminology used, and I'm going to make sure we're all on the same page with that, because I've seen it in documentation and things. Aging. As a nation, America is getting older. With the age of baby boomers, people who were born from 1946 to 1964 becoming older, and that being one of the largest groups, America is deemed to be an older population than it used to be. In the 1960s, when these individuals were young, we were a very youthful nation. And then and our nation has grown as the baby boomers have grown with it. And so the people who are still dictating a lot of what's going on are our baby boomers because they're such a large population. We will see probably in the next 20 years where the baby boomers are getting into they're in their geriatric years, and the younger populations are the people in power and who are elected in power. We may see a shift in how America interacts, but we won't know until that happens. But life expectancy is very different from when it was when the nation was created. When we were creating as a nation, people lived to 35, 30. I'm 36 years old now. I would be elderly in the colonial years because of the things that were happening during that time. Now women are living to their 80s and men are living to the late 70s, and actually we're seeing with this current generation and the health, we're living far longer than that. Stress is probably the biggest killer of people today, and so if you can stay less stressed, and the longer you'll live. Religion. Again, one nation, the one Protestant kind of background. We had many denominations even back then, but we were seeing the growth of a lot of different religions and denominations that we didn't have in those times. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, a lot of different groups of Christianity and breakdowns of denomination. America as a very diverse religious culture, which is very different from the time of our founders. Regional growth and expansion. Today there is a rural and urban divide. Back in the day, where the nation was fairly urban throughout, even in our cities, they were fairly urban. Today, we have large metropolises in the Atlanta area. We have a large metropolitan area, and then we have rural Georgia, a very differing population from Atlanta to the rural parts of Georgia. Very different. And so there is a very different divide between those who live in the rural areas and those who live in the cities. Depending on your ideology, certain areas dominate. The Democrats tend to dominate the metropolitan areas. The Republicans tend to dominate the rural areas. And so we're getting into the political part. Based on the characteristics that happen in those areas, it might change and dictate how people interact. Family size has changed. My grandparents, my grandfather was, on my mother's side, was one of, goodness. Well, let's start with my grandma. My grandmother was one of 13. Um, on my grandmother's side, I think my grandfather was one of 8. They were born on farms, and so children were used as farm hands back in the day, and so many people had more children to help around on the family farm. On my dad's side, now my grandfather was born in Atlanta, so he was one of 2, and that was a city, and so not as much farming. He had a farming background. He can farm. He was farming, and my dad kind of grew up in an area that was still more agricultural Atlanta than metropolitan Atlanta. But my mother's mother was one of 18. And I mean, my grandfather's mother, my father's mother was one of 18. Again, they grew up on a farm. And so he had a lot of children because, again, they were helping with the rural aspect of what was going on during that time. And again, my grandmother, before she came to Atlanta, lived in, the Carolinas. And so there was a lot of farming to do in that area. And so today, family sizes are far smaller because, again, not as many of us farm. Now, we live in a little bit more rural Georgia. Family sizes are a little bit larger than they are in the metropolitan area. I've done surveys in my classes, and when I lived closer to cities, so even if you take Warner Robins versus Telfair County, the populations of people who have multiple siblings are larger in Telfair County than they are in Warner Robins, because Warner Robins is more metropolitan, and Milan and McRae and all those areas are a little bit more rural, and so we still see it a little bit where the family sizes are larger in the rural areas. So finishing up, we're to the last couple slides. I kind of want to go over the old school definitions of what conservative, liberal have been, and some other definitions, because this is kind of still where we're using these definitions today, and this is how we kind of characterize people today. I don't know if these, even our understanding of conservative and liberal or Democrat and Republican, are valid today, because the way that we look at people is different than the definitions that have always existed. Maybe we need new terminology, but at the point in time, we're still going to use these characteristics, because that's how the model that we built our government exists under, with the 2 popular groups today of Democrat and Republican. So conservative, one who believes that government is best that governs least, and that big government should not infringe on individual, personal, and economic rights. Fewer regulations by government. Local and state over federal action, meaning that your locality should make decisions more than federal government just weighing in. Fiscal responsibility, and then private sector handles social issues. Now, that does not mean that if you're a liberal individual or leaning liberal left, that you don't believe in any of these things. But these are the characteristics that have defined conservatives over the last 80 years. Under the conservative flag, there is something called social conservative, social conservatism, which came about in the 1980s. One who believes that traditional and moral teachings should be supported and furthered by government. You see a lot of this during the Reagan administration. Again, certain behaviors and religious teachings should be partnered with the conservative beliefs. Liberals, one who favors government involvement in the economy and the provision of social services, and who takes an activist role in protecting the rights of women, the elderly, minorities, and the environment. Now, again, if you're a conservative, that doesn't mean that you don't care about women or the elderly, minorities, or the environment, but these are areas that the liberal side of the spectrum has championed over the last 80 years. Seeks change in the social and economic status quo, values equality over other aspects of shared political culture, opposes government infringement on private behavior, civil rights, and liberties. Again, these are the areas that liberals have championed. You've seen a lot of terminology here about moderates. A person who takes a relatively middle of the road view might have some conservative values, might have some liberal values. Again, these are ideologies. So your belief system is going to dictate where you feel that you exist on the spectrum, whether you believe that you're a conservative or whether you believe that you're a liberal. It might be a belief system. There are a lot of people who believe they're one thing and are actually something else. It's very interesting. And then there's a term out there, libertarian.